A whisper of secrets. The courtroom was eerily silent. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the room, bouncing off polished wood and anxious faces. A small figure stood at the witness stand. Emma, a 13-year-old girl with a presence far beyond her years. Her delicate fingers gripped the wooden edge tightly, knuckles white with tension. She wore a simple dress, the hem brushing her knees, and her dark curls framed her face like a halo. But it was her eyes, deep and unwavering, that held the room captive. "Your Honor," Emma began, her voice trembling but resolute, "I need to tell the truth about my stepfather. He's not who everyone thinks he is." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Emma's mother, seated just behind her, froze. Her expression was a mix of confusion and disbelief. The man at the defendant's table, her stepfather, Matthew Grayson, leaned back in his chair. He crossed his arms and smirked, the image of composure, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. "Miss Grayson," the judge said, adjusting her glasses, her tone both curious and cautious. "You're making serious claims. Do you have evidence to support what you're saying?" Emma took a deep breath and pulled a small battered leather journal from the inside pocket of her jacket. It was worn and stained, its corners frayed from years of handling. The sight of it sent a visible shudder through Matthew, though he quickly masked it with a cool smile. "This journal," Emma said, holding it up for the courtroom to see, "has everything. It's the truth about who he is and what he's done. And it's worse than anyone here could imagine." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order, but the ripple of voices continued. Emma's mother, Clara, looked at her daughter with wide eyes, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Emma looked at her mother and then turned her gaze back to the judge. "I didn't want to believe it," she said softly, her voice cracking. "But when I found this journal, I couldn't stay silent. Not anymore." 3 months earlier, Emma's life had been ordinary, or so it seemed. After her father's sudden passing 2 years ago, her mother had remarried. Matthew Grayson came into their lives like a knight in shining armor. Handsome, charming, and endlessly generous, he was everything Clara needed during her darkest days. He made their little house feel warm again, always bringing flowers and telling jokes that made Clara laugh like she hadn't in years. At first, Emma adored him too. He taught her to ride a bike, stayed up late helping her with homework, and told her she was brave like her dad. But as time passed, small cracks began to show. Matthew was away often, claiming his work as an entrepreneur demanded late nights and frequent trips. His study was locked at all times, and the one time Emma accidentally walked in, his reaction had been terrifying. "What are you doing in here?" he barked, his voice cold and unfamiliar. He slammed the door shut, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harsh and foreign. Emma hadn't dared to ask him about it, but from that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was wrong. One afternoon, while searching the attic for her sketchbook, Emma found a box labeled "Matthew's Old Stuff." Inside was a photograph of Matthew with 3 other men standing in front of a strange building. They were all smiling, but Matthew's expression seemed forced, his eyes hard. On the back of the photo were the words, "The Bastion, 2015. Emma frowned. She had never heard of the Bastion. Curious, she decided to search online later. But when she casually mentioned the photo to Matthew that evening, his reaction was chilling. "Where did you find that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Emma hesitated, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "In the attic," she replied, trying to sound casual. "I thought it was just an old picture." "Stay out of my things," he snapped, cutting her off. His tone softened almost immediately, his signature smile returning. "I mean, it's nothing important, sweetie. Just some boring work stuff. You wouldn't understand." Emma nodded, but unease settled in her chest like a heavy stone, uncovering the truth. The next day, while Matthew was at work, Emma's curiosity got the better of her. She searched online for the bastion, but found nothing. Undeterred, she decided to investigate further. She rummaged through Matthew's study, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She found nothing until she noticed a small panel at the back of his desk drawer. Prying it open with a ruler, she discovered the leather journal hidden inside. The journal was filled with names, dates, and notes written in cryptic shorthand. Some entries had names crossed out with notes like, "No loose ends," while others had check marks. As Emma flipped through the pages, a cold dread washed over her. Many of the names belonged to people she remembered from her small town, people who had mysteriously disappeared over the years. The final entry made her stomach drop. Clara Grayson. Pending. Emma sat frozen, her mind racing. Her mother's name was in the journal. What did it mean? What was Matthew planning? She clutched the book to her chest, her heart pounding. That night, as she lay awake in bed, she resolved to protect her mother at all costs. But how could she, a 13-year-old girl, take on a man like Matthew Grayson? Her first instinct was to go to the police, but she hesitated. Matthew was beloved in their community. Who would believe her over him? She needed proof, more proof than a cryptic journal. Over the next few weeks, Emma became a shadow in her own home, watching Matthew closely. She noticed the way he checked his phone constantly, the hushed conversations in his study, and the tense meetings with strangers at odd hours. Each new observation added to her growing fear. One evening, she followed him. He left the house late, as he often did, and drove to a remote location on the outskirts of town. Emma trailed him on her bike, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. When he parked near an abandoned warehouse, Emma hid behind a tree and watched as he met with a group of men. The conversation was too faint to hear, but their body language was intense. One man handed Matthew a sealed envelope, which he slipped into his coat pocket before driving away. Emma's fear turned to determination. She would find out what was in that envelope. Whatever it took, she would uncover the truth. Unveiling shadows. The night Emma followed her stepfather to the abandoned warehouse replayed in her mind like a broken record. His hurried demeanor, the exchange of the mysterious envelope, and the unfamiliar men. Each detail painted a darker picture of the man who had integrated so seamlessly into their family. But Emma had no intention of letting fear paralyze her. The next day, as the morning sun peeked through her window, she woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had to act, but she couldn't do it recklessly. She needed evidence, proof so undeniable that no one, not even the police, could dismiss her claims. The envelope. Emma knew she couldn't confront Matthew directly. He was too cunning, too careful. If he even suspected she was onto him, her mother might be in greater danger. Instead, she waited for him to leave for one of his late-night business meetings again. As the sound of his car engine faded into the distance, Emma crept into his study. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air, making her stomach churn. She approached his desk, her fingers trembling as she reached for the drawer she had opened once before. Her heart raced as she pulled it open. The hidden panel was still slightly ajar, exactly as she had left it. But this time, the journal wasn't the only thing inside. Tucked behind a stack of documents was the envelope she had seen exchanged at the warehouse. Emma hesitated. What if Matthew came back early? What if he caught her? She shook off her fear. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about saving her mother. With steady hands, she opened the envelope and pulled out its contents: a photograph, a handwritten list, and a map. The photograph showed Matthew standing with 3 men, the same ones she had seen at the warehouse. One of them had a distinctive scar running from his temple to his jaw. They were standing in front of a van, its license plate partially visible. The handwritten list was even more disturbing. It contained a series of names, some she recognized from town, others unfamiliar. Next to each name were dates and short notes. Confirmed, pending, no trace. The map was marked with several locations, each circled in red. One of the locations was uncomfortably close to her house. Emma's mind raced. She didn't fully understand what the notes meant, but one thing was clear. These weren't random details. Matthew was involved in something far more sinister than she had imagined. A desperate attempt. Emma quickly snapped photos of the documents with her phone. She carefully placed everything back in the envelope and returned it to the drawer. Her hand shook as she closed the desk, ensuring everything appeared untouched. The rest of the night was a blur. Emma couldn't sleep, her thoughts consumed by the dark web of secrets she had uncovered. When dawn broke, she made a decision. She had to show the evidence to someone who could help. At breakfast, Matthew was his usual charming self. He joked with her mother, complimented her cooking, and asked Emma about school. But Emma couldn't meet his eyes. Every word he spoke sounded hollow. Every smile felt forced. "I'll be home late tonight," Matthew said, kissing Clara on the cheek. "Big meeting at work." Clara smiled warmly. "Don't work too hard." Emma clenched her fists under the table. She hated how easily he fooled everyone. As soon as Matthew left, Emma grabbed her backpack and told her mother she was heading to the library. It wasn't a lie. At least not entirely. At the police station, Emma arrived at the small police station just before lunch. The building was modest, with faded paint and a single flagpole swaying in the breeze. Her palms were sweaty as she approached the front desk. "Can I help you?" asked the officer on duty, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a weary expression. Emma nodded, her voice shaking. "I need to report something. It's about my stepfather. He's not who he says he is." The officer raised an eyebrow but gestured for her to sit. "Take your time," he said, pulling out a notepad. "Start from the beginning." Emma recounted everything. The journal, the photograph, the map, the warehouse. She showed the photos on her phone, her voice growing steadier with each detail. The officer's expression shifted from skepticism to concern as he examined the images. "This is serious," he muttered, standing up. "Wait here." Emma sat in the cold, sterile room, her heart pounding. Minutes felt like hours before the officer returned, accompanied by a detective. "Miss Grayson, I'm Detective Harris," the man said, his tone gentle but firm. "I've gone over the information you provided, and I have to say, this is troubling. Do you still have the original documents?" Emma shook her head. "They're in his study. I couldn't take them without him noticing." Harris nodded. "That's smart. Taking them would have tipped him off. We'll need to investigate this carefully. But Emma, I have to ask, does your mother know about any of this?" Emma hesitated. "No. I wanted to tell her, but I don't think she'd believe me." Harris sighed, leaning forward. "That's understandable. People like your stepfather are skilled manipulators. They build trust, then use it to hide their true selves. But now that we have this, we can act. I'll need you to keep this between us for now. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, relief washing over her. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. A fragile trust. When Emma returned home that evening, she found her mother sitting on the couch, her face tense. "Where were you?" Clara asked, her tone sharp. "I told you, at the library," Emma replied, trying to sound casual. "For 6 hours." Clara pressed. "Emma, what's going on? You've been acting strange lately." Emma hesitated. She wanted to tell her mother everything, but the memory of Clara's unwavering trust in Matthew held her back. If she revealed the truth now, would her mother side with her, or with him? "I'd just been stressed about school," Emma lied, forcing a small smile. "It's nothing." Clara studied her for a moment before nodding. "Okay, but if something's bothering you, you can tell me." Emma nodded, her heart aching with the weight of her secret. The silent threat. That night, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't shake the feeling that Matthew knew she had been in his study. His demeanor at dinner had been too perfect, his smile too controlled. As the house settled into silence, Emma's phone buzzed. She grabbed it quickly, her heart racing. It was a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have gone to the police." Emma's blood turned cold. Her hand shook as she stared at the message. How did he know? Did Matthew have someone watching her? She quickly deleted the text and turned off her phone, her mind spinning. She needed to warn the police, but she couldn't risk using her phone. The next morning, as she walked to school, Emma noticed a black car parked near the corner. The windows were tinted, and the engine idled softly. She glanced at it out of the corner of her eye, her heart pounding. Was she being followed? She quickened her pace, her thoughts racing. Matthew was onto her. She had no doubt now. The stakes had just risen, and she had to tread carefully. Secrets in the shadows. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The black car she had seen that morning haunted her thoughts throughout the school day. She glanced over her shoulder at every opportunity, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Her classmates laughed and chattered in the hallways, oblivious to the danger Emma felt creeping closer. By the time the last bell rang, Emma had made up her mind. She couldn't wait for the police to act. Matthew was too dangerous, and every moment she delayed put her mother at greater risk. She needed to find more evidence, something so damning that even Matthew couldn't worm his way out of it. A risky move. Emma decided to skip the bus ride home, and instead headed straight for the police station. She couldn't ignore the text she had received the night before. Someone knew she had gone to the police, but who? Matthew. One of his accomplices. Her every instinct told her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. She needed Detective Harris's advice. The small police station felt like a fortress compared to the open streets. Emma explained the text and the black car to the officer at the front desk, who immediately called Detective Harris. He arrived within minutes, his expression darkening as Emma recounted what had happened. "This confirms what I was worried about," Harris said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Matthew likely has someone watching you. We're dealing with a man who's not just dangerous. He's calculated. He won't make it easy for us to catch him." Emma's chest tightened. "So what do I do? I can't just sit at home and wait for him to..." She paused, unable to finish the thought. "My mom doesn't even know what's going on." Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than enough already, Emma. But if you want to help, I need you to be careful. Don't do anything alone. If you see that car again, call us immediately." Emma nodded, though her mind was already racing with plans. She wasn't just going to sit and wait for the police to act. The break-in. That evening, Emma returned home to find the house unusually quiet. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The comforting scent of roasted chicken filled the air, but Emma's nerves refused to settle. "Hi, sweetie," Clara said with a warm smile. "How was school?" "It was fine," Emma replied, forcing a smile of her own. "I have some homework to do. I'll be in my room." Clara nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Emma's calm exterior. Once in her room, Emma locked the door and opened her laptop. She had taken photos of the map and the handwritten list from Matthew's envelope. Pulling up the images, she studied them closely, her eyes scanning for any detail she might have missed. The map showed several circled locations, but one stood out, a storage facility on the outskirts of town. It was the only location marked with an asterisk, as if it were especially important. Emma's heart raced. What if the answers she needed were there? The idea of sneaking out terrified her, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that this storage facility held the key to unraveling Matthew's secrets. She glanced at the clock. Matthew wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. If she moved quickly, she could make it back before he noticed. A dangerous discovery. The storage facility was tucked away at the end of a desolate road, surrounded by chain-link fences and dimly lit by flickering streetlights. Emma parked her bike behind a cluster of bushes and approached the gate. Her breath puffed in the cold evening air as she surveyed the rows of identical storage units. She had no idea which unit belonged to Matthew, but the asterisk on the map gave her a rough idea of where to start. She wandered through the narrow aisles, her heart pounding with every step. Then she saw it. Unit 47. The number was written in bold black letters on a steel door that looked newer than the others. Emma crouched near the door, examining the lock. It was a simple padlock, not impossible to pick, but certainly beyond her skills. Desperate, she looked around and spotted a rusty crowbar leaning against a pile of discarded wood. It was heavy and unwieldy, but it would have to do. Emma wedged the crowbar into the edge of the lock and pushed with all her strength. The metal groaned in protest, and after several attempts, the lock snapped open. She pushed the door open cautiously, the stale smell of dust and mildew wafting out. Inside, the unit was filled with boxes, filing cabinets, and a large wooden crate. Emma closed the door behind her and switched on her phone's flashlight. She started with the wooden crate, prying it open to reveal several sealed bags filled with cash. Thousands of dollars, maybe more. Her stomach churned. This wasn't just about missing people or strange notes. Matthew was involved in something much larger. Moving to the filing cabinets, Emma rifled through folders filled with contracts, receipts, and photographs. One document caught her eye, a shipping manifest listing items like equipment, supplies, and merchandise. The destination column made her blood run cold. Several shipments had been sent to the same warehouse she had followed Matthew to. But the worst was yet to come. At the bottom of the cabinet was a folder marked Special Projects. Inside were photographs of people, men, women, and children, all accompanied by detailed profiles. Some of the faces were familiar. Emma's stomach dropped as she recognized her neighbor, Mrs. Fitzpatrick, who had vanished 3 years ago. Another photo was marked with a name she didn't recognize but had seen in the journal, Sarah Caldwell. Tears welled in Emma's eyes as the horrifying truth sank in. Matthew wasn't just running a shady business. He was at the center of a criminal operation involving trafficking, extortion, and likely far worse. She needed to get this evidence to the police. Now, caught. As Emma stuffed the documents into her backpack, she heard the faint crunch of gravel outside. Her blood turned to ice. Someone was coming. She quickly turned off her flashlight and crouched behind a stack of boxes. The door creaked open, and heavy footsteps echoed in the small space. "Check everything," a gruff voice said. "Make sure nothing's been touched." Emma's heart pounded. It wasn't Matthew. It was someone else. She peeked through a crack in the boxes and saw 2 men, one of whom was the scared man from the photograph. He held a flashlight, its beam sweeping the room. Emma's mind raced. If they found her, she'd have no way to escape. She glanced at the open window near the ceiling. It was small, but she might be able to squeeze through. As the men moved deeper into the unit, Emma silently climbed onto the stack of boxes. Her movements were slow and deliberate, every creak and rustle making her stomach churn. She reached the window and pushed it open, the cool night air rushing in. "Did you hear that?" one of the men said, his flashlight swinging toward her hiding spot. Emma didn't wait to find out. She pulled herself through the window and dropped to the ground outside, landing in a crouch. Without looking back, she sprinted toward her bike, her lungs burning and her legs screaming in protest. She didn't stop pedaling until she was far away from the storage facility. The revelation. Emma burst into the police station, her backpack heavy with stolen evidence. Detective Harris looked up from his desk, his expression shifting to alarm as he saw her tear-streaked face. "Emma, what happened?" "I found it," she gasped, her voice trembling. "I found everything." She dumped the contents of her backpack onto his desk, the damning documents spilling out. Harris's eyes widened as he sifted through the evidence. This is incredible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, you've just handed us a case that could dismantle an entire criminal network." But Emma wasn't comforted. "They know someone was there," she said, her voice shaking. "They're going to come after me. And my mom." Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Not if we get to them first. You've done something extraordinary, Emma. But now it's our turn. The fallout. The atmosphere at the police station was electric with activity. Detective Harris had called in reinforcements, and officers scrambled to analyze the evidence Emma had brought. Emma sat in a corner of the bustling room, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of cocoa that a kind officer had handed her. She hadn't even taken a sip. Her thoughts were racing too fast for comfort to set in. Across the room, Harris was speaking in urgent tones to a group of plainclothes officers. Emma caught snippets of their conversation. Trafficking ring, warehouse raid, high-priority suspects. Her stomach churned. The documents she'd found in Matthew's storage unit weren't just incriminating, they were explosive. They pointed to a sprawling network of illegal activities stretching across state lines, and Matthew was in the middle of it. But what scared Emma the most was the realization that these weren't just nameless crimes. They were personal. The missing people she'd grown up hearing about, the strange disappearances that had haunted her town, were all connected to the man she had once called her stepfather. The warning. After what felt like hours, Harris finally approached her. His face was a mix of pride and concern. Emma, you've done something remarkable. Thanks to you, we're moving forward with a full-scale operation. We've already issued warrants for several of the names in these documents. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. What about Matthew? She asked, her voice trembling. What happens to him? Harris sighed and crouched down to meet her gaze. We'll arrest him too, but you need to understand something, Emma. People like your stepfather are dangerous because they have resources. He won't go down without a fight. Emma swallowed hard. Does that mean he's coming for us? Not if we can help it, Harris said firmly. We've arranged for you and your mom to be moved to a safe location. Officers will stay with you around the clock. You're not alone in this. The words were meant to comfort her, but Emma couldn't shake the icy fear creeping up her spine. Matthew had always been steps ahead, his calm demeanor masking a calculating mind. She wasn't sure even the police could predict his next move. A fractured trust. By the time Emma returned home, escorted by 2 officers, the weight of the evening's events had begun to settle on her shoulders. The house felt different, colder, darker. Clara was waiting in the living room, her expression a mix of relief and confusion when Emma walked through the door. Emma, where have you been? Clara exclaimed, rushing to embrace her. I've been worried sick. Emma hesitated, glancing at the officers behind her. Mom, we need to talk, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Clara's eyes darted between Emma and the officers, her face pale. What's going on? Why are the police here? Emma took a deep breath and sat her mother down on the couch. The words came tumbling out. Everything she had discovered about Matthew, the evidence she had found, and the danger they were now in. Clara listened in stunned silence, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the couch. When Emma finished, Clara shook her head, her voice breaking. This doesn't make sense, Emma. Matthew isn't perfect, but he's not. He's not a criminal. I know it's hard to believe, Mom, Emma said, her voice cracking. But it's true. The police have the evidence. He's been lying to us this whole time. Clara buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't understand. How could I not have seen it? How could I have let him into our lives? Emma placed a hand on her mother's arm, her own tears threatening to spill. It's not your fault, Mom. He fooled everyone, but we have to stay strong. We have to stick together. The raid. Late that night, Emma and Clara were moved to a secure, safe house on the outskirts of town. It was a modest but comfortable cabin, surrounded by dense woods and monitored by security cameras. 2 officers were stationed outside, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they were facing. Meanwhile, Harris and his team executed a raid on the warehouse Emma had identified. The operation was swift and efficient, resulting in the arrest of several individuals connected to the trafficking ring. Inside the warehouse, officers found further evidence of Matthew's involvement, including ledgers detailing transactions, surveillance equipment, and even more cash. But Matthew himself was nowhere to be found. The game changes. The following morning, Harris arrived at the safe house, his expression grim. "We've dismantled a significant portion of the operation," he told Emma and Clara. "But Matthew managed to slip away before we could get to him." Clara's face drained of color. "What does that mean? Is he coming after us?" "We believe so," Harris admitted. "Matthew knows we're closing in, and he's likely desperate. We're doing everything we can to locate him. But for now, you both need to stay here. Do not leave the house, and do not open the door for anyone unless it's one of us." Emma felt her chest tighten. Matthew's escape wasn't just a failure, it was a threat. He was still out there, watching, waiting, and planning his next move. The call. That night, the phone rang. Emma froze, her eyes darting to her mother, who was sitting at the kitchen table. Clara hesitated before answering, her voice cautious. "Hello." The voice on the other end was calm, almost cheerful. "Hello, Clara." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Matthew." Emma's heart dropped. She moved closer to her mother, straining to hear the conversation. "Don't hang up," Matthew said smoothly. "I just want to talk." "What do you want?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling. "I want my family back," Matthew replied. "This doesn't have to end badly, Clara. Just bring Emma and come home. We can put all of this behind us." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You lied to us. You betrayed us. How could you?" "Clara," Matthew interrupted, his voice hardening. "Think carefully about your next words. You wouldn't want to make things worse for Emma, would you?" Emma grabbed the phone from her mother, her voice filled with anger. "Leave us alone, Matthew. The police are going to catch you, and you'll never hurt us again." There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. "Ah, Emma. Always so brave. But you've made a mistake, my dear. You've underestimated me. This isn't over." The line went dead. A growing fear. Emma set the phone down, her hands shaking. Clara wrapped her arms around her, both of them trembling with fear. The officers stationed outside were alerted, but there was little they could do. Matthew's call was untraceable, and his whereabouts remained unknown. That night, Emma sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. She couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that Matthew was closer than they realized. And she was right. The silent intruder. In the early hours of the morning, Emma was jolted awake by a faint noise. She sat up, her heart pounding. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again, a soft creak, like footsteps on the porch. She crept to the window and peeked outside. A figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the pool of light cast by the porch lamp. Emma's breath caught in her throat. It was Matthew. A desperate night. The silhouette on the porch sent a wave of terror through Emma. Matthew's figure was unmistakable, even cloaked in the shadows. Her instincts screamed at her to hide, to call for help, but she couldn't risk making a sound. Slowly, she stepped back from the window, her breath trembling as she tried to steady herself. Her mother, Clara, was asleep in the next room. The two officers stationed outside were meant to protect them, but their absence at this critical moment sent a chill down Emma's spine. Why weren't they at their post? Emma crept to her mother's door and gently shook her awake. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Emma, what's wrong?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "He's here," Emma murmured, her voice barely audible. "Matthew's outside." Clara bolted upright, fear flashing in her eyes. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her fingers fumbling as she dialed the emergency number. But the call didn't go through. A robotic voice echoed through the receiver. "Your call cannot be completed as dialed." "What's happening?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Emma's mind raced. Matthew had planned this. He had cut off their communication somehow, isolating them just as he had done to his other victims. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. An unseen ally. The silence in the house was suffocating. Emma tiptoed to the living room, her eyes darting to the windows. Outside, Matthew moved closer to the house, his movements deliberate and measured. He wasn't trying to rush. He wanted them to know he was there. Emma noticed something on the coffee table. The small two-way radio the officers had given them in case of emergencies. Her heart leaped. She grabbed it, pressing the button to transmit. "This is Emma Grayson. Matthew is here. Please, someone, help us." The static crackled for a moment. Then a voice responded. "Emma, this is Officer Davis. Stay calm. We're on our way." The relief was short-lived. Outside, Matthew paused and tilted his head, as if he could sense something was wrong. He took a step back into the shadows, disappearing from view. Emma's stomach dropped. He wasn't leaving. He was changing his approach, a calculated invasion. The next sound they heard was the faint creak of the back door. Emma's blood ran cold. Matthew had found another way in. She grabbed her mother's hand, pulling her toward the small closet in the hallway. "Mom, hide in here," Emma whispered, pushing her inside. "I'll distract him." "No," Clara hissed, grabbing Emma's arm. "I'm not leaving you alone." "You have to," Emma said firmly. "He's here for me. If you stay hidden, the police will get here in time. Please, Mom." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," she whispered before closing the door. Emma turned and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter, her fingers tightening around its cold metal grip. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, every fiber of her being told her to run. But she couldn't. She wouldn't let Matthew win. A game of cat and mouse. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Emma moved silently, her footsteps careful and deliberate. She heard him before she saw him. A faint shuffle near the dining room. "Emma," Matthew's voice called out, soft and chilling. "You don't have to be afraid. I just want to talk." Emma gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay quiet. She crouched behind the kitchen island, peeking around the corner. Matthew was there, his figure looming in the dim light. He held something in his hand, a small, gleaming knife that caught the moonlight. "I know you're here," he continued, his tone almost playful. "You've always been clever, Emma. That's what I admire about you. But cleverness won't save you tonight." Emma's heart pounded. She needed to lure him away from her mother's hiding spot. But how? Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her gaze landed on a small stack of plates on the counter. She grabbed one and threw it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the sound echoing through the house. Matthew turned sharply, his knife raised. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice laced with amusement. Emma ducked low, moving quickly toward the stairs. She needed to keep him distracted, to buy time for the police to arrive. She reached the second floor and slipped into her bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Her hands shook as she locked it. The confrontation. The sound of Matthew's footsteps grew louder as he climbed the stairs. Emma pressed herself against the wall, her flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. She could hear her own heartbeat, a deafening drumbeat in the stillness. The doorknob rattled. "Emma, let's not play games," Matthew said, his voice calm but menacing. "You've done enough damage already. It's time to end this." Emma didn't respond. She moved to the window, her eyes scanning the yard below. Where were the police? The seconds felt like hours. Suddenly, the door burst open, the lock splintering under Matthew's force. He stepped into the room, his knife glinting in the pale light. Emma raised the flashlight, its beam shining directly into his eyes. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling but strong. Matthew shielded his eyes, a sinister smile curling across his lips. "You're brave, I'll give you that," he said, stepping closer. But bravery won't save you. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't overpower him, but she could outsmart him. She threw the flashlight at him with all her strength. It struck his shoulder, making him stumble, and she used the moment to dart past him and out the door. The rescue. As Emma raced down the stairs, red and blue lights flooded the windows. The sound of sirens filled the air, and she nearly collapsed in relief. The police were here. Matthew, realizing his time was up, bolted toward the back door. But before he could escape, officers swarmed the house, their weapons drawn. Hands in the air, one of them shouted, "Now." Matthew hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to Emma, who stood frozen at the base of the stairs. His calm facade cracked, revealing a flash of anger. But he had no choice. Slowly, he dropped the knife and raised his hands. Two officers tackled him to the ground, cuffing him as he snarled in frustration. Emma's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. It was over. Clara rushed out of the closet, pulling Emma into a tight embrace. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're safe." The aftermath. Matthew was taken into custody, his crimes finally catching up with him. The evidence Emma had uncovered, combined with his attempted break-in, left no doubt about his guilt. The police assured Emma and Clara that he would face the maximum sentence. But even as the days passed and the danger faded, the scars remained. Emma struggled with nightmares, her mind replaying the night over and over. Clara blamed herself for not seeing the truth sooner, though Emma reassured her it wasn't her fault. One evening, Detective Harris visited them at their temporary safe house. He brought good news. Matthew's entire network had been dismantled, thanks in large part to Emma's bravery. "You're a hero, Emma," Harris said, his tone filled with admiration. "You didn't just save yourself and your mother, you saved countless others." Emma nodded, her heart heavy but proud. She had faced her greatest fear and emerged stronger. And while the road ahead would be long, she knew one thing for certain. She and her mother were survivors. Together, they would rebuild their lives, one day at a time. Rebuilding hope. The days following Matthew's arrest were surreal. Emma and Clara stayed in the police-designated safe house, far from their hometown. The quiet of the woods that surrounded the cabin offered a temporary sense of security, but the shadows seemed longer, the silence heavier. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle of the wind made Clara flinch, and Emma's heart still raced at unexpected sounds. The police continued to update them on the case. Detective Harris visited frequently, each time with news of another breakthrough. Matthew's operations had stretched farther than anyone had imagined, and the evidence Emma had uncovered was pivotal in dismantling his network. But even with the safety net of the law around them, Clara and Emma struggled to feel at ease. The long night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the forest, Clara sat on the porch with a cup of tea, staring into the distance. Emma joined her, the weight of the past few weeks etched into her young face. "Do you think it's really over?" Emma asked softly, breaking the silence. Clara sighed, reaching out to take her daughter's hand. "I don't know, Emma, but we can't let fear control us. We've come this far. We've survived. That has to count for something." Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the tree line. "I keep thinking about what he said, that I'm like him." Clara's grip tightened. "You are nothing like him, Emma. Don't ever believe that." "But I knew what he was capable of, and I still took the risk. What if he was right? What if—" "Stop," Clara interrupted, her voice firm but gentle. She turned to face her daughter, her eyes brimming with love and determination. "You're brave, Emma. You're smart, and you have a heart that won't let you stand by when something is wrong. That's why you did what you did, not because you're like him, but because you're everything he isn't." Tears filled Emma's eyes, but she managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." Clara pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as if she could shield her from the world. "We're going to be okay, she whispered. "No matter what, we're going to be okay." Facing the public. Days turned into weeks, and the trial date approached. The prosecutors had built an airtight case against Matthew, and Emma was called to testify. The thought of standing in a courtroom again, facing the man who had terrorized her family, made her stomach churn. But she knew it was something she had to do. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras poised, and strangers filled the benches, eager to hear the shocking details of the case. Emma sat beside Clara, her hands clutching a folder of notes Harris had helped her prepare. When Matthew was brought into the room, Emma's breath hitched. He was shackled, his once dominant presence diminished by the orange jumpsuit he now wore. But his eyes still held the same calculating intensity, and when they met Emma's, her resolve faltered for a moment. Then she remembered everything she had been through. The fear, the courage it took to uncover the truth, and the lives she had potentially saved. She straightened her back, her hazel eyes locking with his. She wasn't the same scared girl he had tried to manipulate. She was stronger now. Emma's testimony. When it was Emma's turn to testify, the room fell silent. She walked to the stand with steady steps, her heart pounding but her head held high. As she recounted everything she had discovered, the journal, the storage unit, the warehouse, her voice grew stronger. She detailed how Matthew had infiltrated their lives, the lies he had told, and the danger he posed to everyone around him. "Why did you take the risk?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Why not just stay silent?" Emma paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before landing on Matthew. "Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I knew what he was doing was wrong, and I couldn't let it continue. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt." The courtroom was silent for a moment, then filled with murmurs of admiration. Clara wiped away tears, pride radiating from her as she watched her daughter. Matthew's defense attorney tried to rattle Emma during cross-examination, but she held her ground. When the questioning ended, Emma stepped down from the stand, her head high and her resolve unshaken. Justice is served. The trial lasted several days, but the outcome was clear from the start. Matthew was found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy, trafficking, and attempted murder. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never hurt anyone again. When the verdict was read, Clara wept openly, and Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, but more than that, they had reclaimed their lives. As they left the courthouse, reporters crowded around them, microphones and cameras thrust in their faces. Emma took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed them. "I didn't do this because I'm brave or special," she said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that even when you're scared, you can still make a difference." Her words were broadcast far and wide, inspiring countless others to stand up against injustice, no matter the odds. A new beginning. Months later, Clara and Emma moved to a new town, far from the shadows of their past. Their new house was small but cozy, surrounded by a garden that Clara loved tending to. Emma started at a new school, where she quickly made friends and joined the art club. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs to rebuild. Every day, Emma worked to let go of the fear that had gripped her for so long. She threw herself into her art, finding solace in the act of creating. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara turned to Emma and smiled. "You know, I think your dad would be proud of you." Emma looked out at the horizon, the warm colors painting the sky. "I hope so," she said softly. "I miss him." "I do too," Clara replied, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But I know he'd be proud of the woman you're becoming." "I know I am." Emma leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her. They had faced their worst fears and come out stronger. Together, they had built a new foundation, one of hope, resilience, and the courage to face whatever came next.